Hi, Bret.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Doing pretty well. How about you?
I can't complain. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available on both streaming video and via audio podcast. You're Bret Weinstein. You are in Washington State, where until some months ago, you were actually teaching evolutionary biology at Evergreen State College. And today we're going to talk about kind of the psychology of tribalism, political polarization in America, because you somewhat famously found yourself in the middle of an instance of, I guess you could say, the psychology of tribalism and political polarization. Certainly you're more famous than you were before that happened to you. There was a pretty well-known incident at Evergreen State that led you to, well, for one thing, no longer be teaching there. I don't know if you is there a chance you'll go back? Is this, or is this kaput?
I think there is essentially no chance of going back. In fact, when my wife and I settled with the college, they tied their own hands and made it impossible for them to rehire us, which was an interesting move.
And you didn't take that as a compliment, I guess.
I don't take much that the administration of the college says very seriously anymore.
Okay.
There was a time that I did, but there was a change in administration, and frankly, I think nothing has made sense ever since.
Okay, so I want to, the story is well known by some people, but I think we should review it kind of quickly. I'm mainly interested in the dynamics of how it played out and in the aftermath, and I'm interested in how it's changed your life. And also we should say that if people want the most detail, or, want more background after this, I think you and your wife, who also taught at Evergreen, wrote something for the Washington Examiner. We'll link to that. And then there was, you were on the Glenn Show, a Blogging Heads TV show, some months ago, and you recounted it in some detail. That may be interesting to people as well.
That's true. And if you want the hot off the presses take, the first big interview that I did was on the Rubin Report with Dave Rubin.
Okay.
So anyway, if you want to get the sense of how this seemed as it was unfolding, that's the place to go. Okay.
So let me tell you what I think happened. I'll probably get something a little wrong, and you can correct me. But basically, at Evergreen, which is it's an experimental college, a public college, but an experimental one, and for that reason, somewhat left-leaning. And there had been this thing called a day of absence, during which I gather students of color were encouraged to feel free to not show up as a way, as I guess, a kind of testament to their significance or something. I don't know exactly the logic of it, but in any event, and was this something that they had kind of lobbied for? This was an initiative that had originated with students of color?
Day of Absence started almost at the inception of the college, back in the early 70s. And I believe it was started by a black female faculty member.
Okay.
And initially it was black students and faculty that absented themselves. Later it was generalized to people of color.
Including staff, in other words. I see. Oh, I see what you mean. Beyond black. Okay.
Right. So I have my own doubts about whether or not it was an effective statement. In other words, the whole idea of Day of Absence is predicated on a play by Douglas Turner Ward, a black playwright, in which the black population of a fictional southern town doesn't show up for work one day in order to reveal what role they've been playing that has been undervalued. The difference between a town and a college, though, is very significant. And one thing that is quite true of the Day of Absence as it functioned, at least while Heather and I were at Evergreen, was that it did not bring the college to a halt. In fact, Heather and I both, in thinking back over the 15 years that we were connected to the college, can't actually remember any students of ours that didn't come to class on the Day of Absence.
So students of color actually tended to show up in your experience?
Well, I suspect that what it is that there's a distinction between the part of the college involved in the hard sciences and the part of the college that studies the humanities and the arts. And so it may be that it was a bigger deal in another part of the college, but you can imagine being a science student in a class that is going to cover material that will be important to you on one day, and you're told you maybe should consider not showing up, but then in some ways you're penalizing yourself if the material is cumulative. So, professors did make allowances, and I certainly would have made allowances for any student that decided not to show up. But what I'm getting at is that it was a minor concern for 15 years, and then suddenly, at the point that the committee that organizes it decided to invite white people not to come to campus, it became a very big deal.
And so students and faculty of color were going to come, but white professors were not going to come. So it was kind of the opposite idea.
Well, let's put it this way. If it had simply been the opposite, the true opposite, then one could make a defense of it. But the fact is, those who organized the day of absence were overwhelmingly people of color. And so people of color deciding to absent themselves is one thing. Anybody deciding to absent somebody else is not the opposite. It is, or it is the opposite in some way that is asymmetrical, right? In other words, absenting yourself to make a statement, that's an act that a free person might engage in. But if you are absenting somebody else, you are limiting their freedom. Right. And so we were not instructed not to come, but the administration signed on to the idea that we were encouraged not to come, and that therefore, if we did come, it suggested that there was something not quite right about our allegiance with people of color.
Okay.
And so that was coercive, and I reacted to its coerciveness.
Well, and you reacted in on an email list, kind of, with some that involved faculty and I guess some students who were part of some kind of network. And then the email was publicized. In other words, you didn't initially make a big public statement about it. You were discussing it in an email list, and your reservations about it came to light.
Well, so I would invite people to look into the deep story. There'd be no way to cover the whole thing, even if we took your entire podcast. And frankly, to tell the entire story would make me sound a little crazy until people had looked into the evidence for themselves. But the central fact, yes, I went to the email list for faculty and staff because some students work on campus. There were some students on that list, but it was a tiny fraction of the student body. But why did I go to the email list? I went there because the new administration of the college, the new president, had shut down all of the normal opportunities for faculty to talk to each other about the governance of the college. So faculty meetings, which for the entire period that Heather and I were teaching at Evergreen, were places of vigorous discussion and disagreement over important things. They were very healthy places, were turned into a place where announcements were made and presentations were given, but discussion was impossible. So I took to the one place that I could access all of my colleagues. And I should point out, in the aftermath of Heather and my resigning, that one place that faculty could access each other has now been shut down. So faculty now have to go through a moderation stage in order to email each other, which is
couldn't they just start their own list? I mean, some renegades could start it, and presumably a lot of faculty would want to join. But it doesn't matter. No, this is neither here nor there. But that would be my recommendation. Anyway, it just seems to me part of the technological age we're in is when hierarchy is harder to impose because people can do things like this if they want, but I guess they haven't gone there yet. So,
well, I would argue that there's actually something here worth talking about, which has to do with the mindset that accompanies the kind of movement that took place at Evergreen. So lots of people who are watching their college erode out from under them are vocally supportive of what is taking place because a dynamic has been set up in which you are either with us or against us. So even setting up a list outside of the college would be fraught because signing up for that list would likely be seen as hostile.
So you're saying professors who are actually concerned about changes in the tenor of discourse among students and so on are don't want to be seen as defying the trend, as taking exception to what's going on? Is that?
Well, I think a number of things are going on. One, I believe there's something about the way academia is structured at the moment that selects for a kind of cowardice. And so there is a disproportionate level of cowardice amongst the faculty. But there is also a very accurate perception that those who step out of line will be penalized, and that those penalties ultimately may involve being ushered off the campus. So people who have no alternative career plan are looking at their own interests, and they're letting the college effectively be the college that they knew. They are allowing it to be dissolved out from under them in an effort to preserve their own income stream.
Mm-hmm. So there were, just to move through what happened to you, there was vocal resistance to your position once it became known. I think there's a video somewhere. I actually haven't seen it, but where students are kind of confronting you and you're trying to talk to them. And we can link to that. And as I recall from your conversation with Glenn, the students who knew you, including the students of color who knew you, who had been in your classes, were not part of the blowback. And in fact, in some cases, tried to argue with students who I gather included both students of color and white students who were part of the blowback. I guess that attempt was largely unsuccessful. I think it got to the point where you had reason to fear for your physical safety, and I think even some local law enforcement people agreed that you'd be wise to take precautions.
Well, let me clean that up a little bit. Yes, none of my students or my wife's students agreed that there was anything concerning, that there was racism. The students who alleged racism were entirely unknown to us. Many students did defend us, including students of color. And the important thing that people should realize, especially if they are on some other campus where something like this unfolds, is that there was a special penalty for students of color who stood up and violated the narrative that was being advanced by this movement. So if you were a white person and you said that I, for example, was not a racist, that was bad. But if you had dark skin and you said that was really bad because it made it impossible to sell the story. So a special penalty reserved for people who are distinctly at odds with the narrative that's being advanced is characteristic of how a witch hunt like this unfolds.
So what kinds of consequences did those students face?
Well, one student, somebody who knew Heather and me very well, somebody who had been on our year-long program, which went for 11 weeks to Ecuador the prior year, was chastised for studying science as a person of color, as if that was some kind of race traitor-like behavior. When two students of color stood up in an extremely contentious meeting to defend me, they were first shouted down, and then they had people assigned to them to explain to them what they had misunderstood about their own experience. So the idea that people of color in particular needed to be silenced if they were stepping out of line was very clear if you were on the ground.
Okay, so so this happened. You left the college. I guess initially it was less clear than it is now how permanent that was going to be, but teaching was not tenable. That was not.
No, quite to the contrary. The protest, which was really orchestrated by faculty, but it was manned by students. Students came and disrupted my class. I tried to reason with them.
Well, let me just zero in on that. You're saying the protests against you were actually orchestrated by faculty, or did I misunderstand?
Absolutely.
So, well, I hadn't picked up on this part of the story. I mean, and these were these faculty that you knew personally or kind of knew only in passing? Were they by and large from the humanities, so they weren't your closest colleagues in the sciences division?
Well, this goes back to the unique structure of Evergreen. Evergreen doesn't have departments. Among the many structures that the founders threw out, departments was one of them. So there's close contact across disciplines in a way you might not expect. The ringleader of the protests was somebody I did not know well, but the college faculty is only a couple hundred people, and I had been there for 14 years at the point this erupted. So I knew everybody except for very new hires at one level or another. I'd been in meetings with them and things like that. So there was one particular ringleader at the very top. She is now also gone from the college.
And I feel I have to ask about her ethnicity, given the context.
Well, I think it's a perfectly fair question. And while her ethnicity shouldn't make any difference, the fact that this movement is built around what's called intersectionality, and that the particular faculty member, as far as I know, was gay, was female, was black, said she was disabled, though I don't know what her disability was, and therefore would be at the top of what is called the progressive stack.
And we should say, because it's a relatively new term, intersectionality is the idea that, I mean, I'm not even that clear on it myself, but it's the idea that if you are if you lack privilege along one dimension, I mean, I guess the apex of privilege would be white, male, straight, whatever, and if you differ from that along any of those dimensions, you are to some extent, I don't know, underprivileged isn't quite right, but you know what I mean. But the idea is that the lack of privilege is kind of more than the sum of its parts almost, or is it just that it's more than additive almost?
Well, that's quite well put, I would say. The idea is that there is some emergent character to intersecting axes of oppression. And undoubtedly there is some truth in that. I have no doubt that if you are both gay and black, it's different than being either black or gay. So I'm not doubting that there's some phenomenon that one might study there. The troubling part is that this is used to justify a set of essentially policy initiatives in which population level analysis is dethroned and is replaced by what's called lived experience. So lived experience replaces the study of patterns, and people are therefore in a position to speak about privilege with a hierarchy. And the hierarchy is based on how many of these intersectional axes one can claim to have suffered a deficit along.
So what would be an example of the study of patterns that this is displacing?
So if we look at something like the rate of hiring of women by Google, the subject of the Google memo written by James Damore, that is a population level question. Is there something wrong at Google? Quite possible there is. How would you know? Well, you could look at the population of people who applied for jobs at Google. You could make some assessment of how qualified the applicants were, and then you could see whether being male predicted that a person of a given level of qualification was more likely to be hired for an engineering job than somebody who was female and equally qualified. That would tell you, hey, there's a problem at Google that needs to be solved. On the other hand, if you ask an individual, all right, you're female, you're at Google, is sexism the reason that there are more male engineers than female engineers? That person may have a perspective, and that perspective undoubtedly contains information. But, you know, we as, I guess you're a biologist, you're a self-trained biologist, I'm a formally trained biologist, but as a biologist, you'd have to recognize, well, the answer to that question is going to require a careful analysis. It's going to require a rigorous experimental design. It's going to require a large enough sample size in order to drown out the noise that could otherwise fool you into believing you're seeing something. But this intersectionality movement essentially throws out all of the accumulated wisdom about how one detects real patterns from mirages and replaces it with anecdote. And
so you are more than a data point if you are if you represent this kind of intersectionalism in some, to the extent that you embody intersectionalism, you're more than a data point. You have testimony that has distinctive power.
So I don't even want to say that that's false. I'm sure you do have testimony that has distinctive power. But in terms of our figuring out where there's a problem that needs to be addressed and what methods might be used to address it, we have to use a dispassionate analysis. And intersectionality is the opposite of a dispassionate analysis. It quite literally says the validity of your perspective can be assessed based on the number of these intersectional metrics that you can claim to have been disadvantaged along. And it's just simply not a robust methodology. It is two things. One, it is a feeble methodology. And two, it is an invitation to bad actors who happen to find themselves in several of these intersectional categories at once and decide to use that leverage to do things like what happened at Evergreen, to derail a college. Mm-hmm. So, it happens that one gay, female, black faculty member actually substantially altered the trajectory of the college, where if we all, Evergreen was a radically egalitarian place where no faculty member outranked any other faculty member. Even tenured faculty members didn't outrank adjuncts. So the ability for one person to derail such a place under normal circumstances would be near zero. But in the case that we decide that your right to speak is based on your intersectional score, one person was very capable of derailing the place.
Okay.
So it's an invitation to danger.
So, especially in a place like Evergreen, she had particular kind of social and political power by virtue of her identity, and she, in your view, used it to kind of orchestrate this thing. Students were happy to be part of it, I guess. And so then kind of all hell broke loose. And then there were confrontations. I don't know if there were how many, but you before long stepped away from the college. Is that what happened?
No, and actually, I think I'm a little surprised we're spending so much time on Evergreen. But as long as we're here, what happened was I continued to face my accusers and attempt to reason with them. On the second day of the protest, the chief of police of our campus police, which is a real police force, but it is a real police force that reports to the president of the college. The chief of police called me and said, "Are you on campus?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Don't come to campus." And I said, "Why?" And she said, "Because students are stopping vehicles on the campus. They are searching for what they say is an individual, and we think it's you." And she said, "Further, I can't protect you." And I said, "Why not?" And she said, "Because the president has told us to stand down." So students were hunting faculty members on campus. A day later, they photographed themselves with baseball bats. Not all of the students, but several of the students photographed themselves with baseball bats. They had molded themselves into some sort of anarchist police force and were roving the campus intimidating people. There was actually a battery that was filmed by the person who was hit, a confrontation with these bat-wielding students. And all the while, the president has told the police, you should not intervene. Mm-hmm. So what happened at Evergreen is, I'm speaking in perfectly literal terms here, it was an experiment in sovereignty and an experiment in anarchy. The president of the college told the police to stop enforcing the law. The students, many of whom were anarchists, and I don't mean that they favored chaos, I mean they were ideologically,
yeah.
Yeah, they took over the campus and started enforcing their own rules based on this concept of intersectionality. That's just a literal description of what happened. And it is very hard to convey to people who weren't there and didn't see it what it is like to have a small patch of territory within the United States experiment with sovereignty and anarchy and have no one step in to do anything about it. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you're right, we spent a lot of time on this, but it's been interesting and I think it is relevant. So let's kind of move to, the two things maybe, to talk a little about the part of human psychology we're seeing and also about the political context, broadly speaking, the American political context this is taking place in, both on campus and off. As for the human psychology, it's an interesting thing that students who knew you, both white and students of color, we're not part of your problem. And I mean, this is itself an interesting dynamic, and it has pros and cons. The way interpersonally cultivated affinity can withstand a lot of things. I mean, for example, if a good friend of yours is accused of bank fraud, and it turns out that there are all these, people who are impoverished by them, you're going to be inclined to kind of give them a break if they've been a good friend. So it has its downside, but in any event, it's a strong feature of human psychology, right?
Yes, although there is something about Evergreen you need to understand in order to see why the dynamic unfolded the way it did. The best part of Evergreen involved the fact that we didn't have classes. What we had were programs in which faculty taught one program full time, and that program could go on for as long as a full year. Mm-hmm. And students took one program at a time, and they could stay in that program for a full year in many cases. What this created was a kind of learning community that's unlike anything reproduced anywhere else that I'm aware of. You could take your students into the wilderness for a week because they didn't have any other classes that they needed to attend. So my students, not every single one of them, but many of my students, every single quarter, knew me very well. I mean, they knew me personally. In effect, they were asymmetrical friendships, but they were friendships. And so at the point that students that were unknown showed up and started accusing me of racism, my students weren't reacting based on a casual impression of me. They were reacting based on knowing me quite well. So anyway, not only were they not part of the protest, but many of them were quite courageous, and they in fact went with me to the most dangerous confrontation there was because they were worried about my safety and they thought they might be able to do something about it. Mm-hmm. So this was really, if there's one heartening thing about this, it was that it revealed everybody's character, and many of the students that Heather and I had taught shined in that circumstance.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting, I mean, this is quite tangential, but the fact that the students of color stuck with you, I mean, every time I see, when I'm watching a basketball game and I see a fight break out and a white teammate run to the assistance of a black teammate or the other way around, I'm reminded that, racism is not in the genes. I mean, groupism is in the genes. People identify with groups, but that's, I guess, something. And so as for the way
I would differ with you on whether or not racism is in the genes.
Really?
Yeah. Now, I want to be very cautious about how I say this because obviously we could get into a lot of hot water just through imprecision.
You could.
Yeah, I suppose. I would argue that racism is a potential in the genes, that because so much of human success has come at the expense of some population that couldn't defend itself, that the capacity for racism has been favored over evolutionary history. What is not in the genes is a hardwired program for racism. So the reason that I think this is so important is that if I understand the biology of humans correctly, then it is all important that we create developmental environments that cause the potential for racism not to be realized in individual racism. And what you see when you see that fight on the basketball court and you see a white player coming to the aid of a black player, what you see is something that has taken precedence over this sort of low-level potential that does exist in people.
Well, I certainly agree that the safeguards against the manifestation of racism need to be kind of in place. We need to work on it, but I still don't think it's because racism per se is in the genes. And the reason I say that, and I know there are others who agree with this. In fact, I just was listening to Steve Pinker's new book, and he kind of said this thing that I had said, which is that the races per se during human evolution would not have encountered one another very often. In other words, there were groups, there was intergroup competition. And there was violent intergroup competition, but the people you were competing with looked almost exactly like you. For in almost all encounters that we have reason to believe took place. So the idea of during the hunter-gatherer phase of human evolution, for example, the idea of white, starkly different looking people encountering each other with any frequency seems to a lot of people unlikely. That's all I mean.
Well, I would argue, first of all, that evolutionary psychology has yet to level up and deal with what human beings really are as a product of evolution. And that part of the problem is that we view ourselves, because there is some truth in it, we view ourselves as Pleistocene hunter-gatherers in the internet age, when in fact we have attributes that owe themselves to the Pleistocene, but we also have lots of evolved attributes that came about later, including after farming. Now, there's a question about how many of those post-farming adaptations are encoded in the genes. And so this is why I've been careful, and I've said the potential for racism exists in the genes. And with respect to your question about how often people who looked different at the level that we would call them races, and incidentally, I don't think race is the right term. I think population is the right term. But to the extent that the question is how often would people of different races have found themselves in conflict, the answer is increasingly often the later you get in human history. And so if you believe that human history or that evolution is slow moving with respect to humans, then you would say, well, there hasn't been very much time for the potential to accumulate. If you believe that there's something about humans that is rapidly adapting, then you'll see a greater potential for it. But really, the only thing you need is for human beings to have a bias in favor of individuals who are more closely related to them, and for that bias not to taper off. And so you can encounter people who look like you but don't quite sound like you, and you can find them a little bit suspect. And then at the point that you find people who don't quite look like you would continue to find them a bit suspect. And then at the point that you run into people who really don't look like you would still continue to find them a bit suspect. So anyway, my point would be you don't need to have had long-standing interracial competition or conflict in order to have selection for the things that set you up for that conflict at the point that you are routinely encountering people from other races.
Well, I certainly agree. There are psychological things that set you up for racial conflict, but I think they are things that set you up for group conflict generically and kind of in some metaphorical sense, tribal conflict generically. I mean, we shouldn't have a big argument about this. The last thing I'd say, and then I'll give you the last word on this if you want it, but is that I don't think it's just a question of during what parts of evolution would alien groups, be coming into contact with one another, completely alien groups. I think there is coalitional conflict within societies that has real stakes, and there is coalitional conflict between neighboring societies that know each other, or conflict between neighboring societies that know each other and speak exactly the same language and so on, that have real stakes. So I think the psychological mechanisms that govern group conflict have been taking shape for a very, very long time. And of course, the hunter-gatherer phase of human evolution, whatever significance you attribute to the later part, the hunter-gatherer part lasted a lot longer. So that's all I would say is, and I don't think we want to get into individual versus group selection, but because we'd have to explain what they are, and that's not what this is about. But that's I doubt we disagree all that significantly on the nature of the actual psychological adaptations governing group conflict. I think you agree they are readily transferable from one kind of group to another. These are the people of my flag, these are the people of my whatever. The mechanisms that come into play are basically the same. Or, to get back to this, I am in the pro Bret Weinstein tribe at Evergreen. I am in the anti Bret Weinstein tribe at Evergreen. It's the same psychological mechanisms that are biasing thought, possibly on both sides. I'm sure you would agree it was biasing it on one side. Regardless of what the definition of the tribe is, I guess I'd say.
Well, two things. I would be very careful not to think in terms of group competition.
Okay, so you're not a group selection. It's fine. I'm not particularly one either. So we can.
Yeah, I can't imagine that you are. But I would say that many of us get into trouble because we detect that we are looking for some evolutionary property and group is nearby, and so we reach for it. I don't think it's groups, but I do think it's something of that scale. And at some point, I will advance a model that I think will solve that issue. But in the meantime, what I would say is anytime we reach for a term like group, we are needlessly imprecise. And your example of the groups at Evergreen it reveals exactly the problem with this style of thinking here. So I've argued here that people naturally affiliate with those most closely related to them. The entity that accused me of racism was not one population. It was clearly a coalition, and I would argue one that was unstable because at the point that it had succeeded, it was going to come apart. And in fact, we saw evidence of that. But what it was up against, what you've called the pro-Bret Weinstein forces, weren't pro-Bret Weinstein forces. What they were forces that were pro-Enlightenment, pro-inquiry, and pro-reason. And so the bottom line message here, which I think, frankly, if we follow it all the way to the end, is going to end up very near neighbors with what I believe your points about Buddhism are. But the basic point is we are wired for a kind of tribal conflict. We are also wired for a higher morality and reason that can overcome those tribal biases. And that the game, if as it were, is really about creating environments that bring out those, those better angels, if I can borrow that phrase here. I should say I used that phrase in the title of a paper before Pinker had published his book with that title. But
and of course, who was it originally? Abraham Lincoln?
Abraham Lincoln, exactly. So in any case, we should be thinking in terms of creating developmental environments that sideline our population against population competition modality in favor of a collective inquiry and reason and fairness based rubric. And the fact is, we've all, I no doubt you in your experiences in the world at Princeton and elsewhere have encountered rooms full of people who really are not arguing from those kinds of tribal impulses, but are really interested in figuring out what's true. I've encountered them. And the point is, can we globalize that?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I would say, I'm not going to, first of all, yes, we agree that, although I consider tribal kind of a metaphor, I mean, in some ways misleading, but it's a term I use, tribal psychology. Yes, we do have adaptations that govern conflict between groups and that warp our thinking. Agree on that. But I'm not going to back down so quickly from my idea of the utility of thinking of it as a pro-Bret Weinstein and an anti-Bret. Because for one thing, you said, no, it's not pro-Bret Weinstein. We're just pro-Enlightenment. Of course, the other side would say, we're not anti-Bret Weinstein. We're pro-equity. That's their term, right? Equity is the new version of a new term for a certain kind of egalitarianism. And that's their term. But I mean, and so, of course, it's part of the psychology of group conflict that we always characterize our group in morally lofty terms, right?
Well, yes, but that does not suggest that there are not causes for which that is justified and other causes.
No, I think there are causes for which it's justified. And actually, both of these causes in the abstract, right? Egalitarianism and Enlightenment are good.
Yeah, but the thing is, you really need to pay very close attention to what this looks like on the ground, right? Because to you and me, equity sounds like a synonym or a near synonym for egalitarianism or for equality. But if you ask the people who are flying that banner what they mean by it, that isn't what they mean by it. They cannot define it. What they will do is they will give you examples, and they are flawed examples, in which it is the obvious right solution and it involves somebody's advancement over somebody else. So we are refighting battles that have already been won on an analytical basis. We are refighting a battle between equality of opportunity and equality of outcome. And the thing that amazed me more than anything else in this whole thing was the fact that when Enlightenment values are entered into the conversation, the forces that are fighting for equity, who can't define equity, are actually quite willing to tell you that they're not interested in Enlightenment values. They're actually challenging those values, and they are literally challenging science. I mean, a week ago, there was apparently graffiti at Evergreen saying, effectively equating science with white supremacy. Now, I don't know how to convey to people how dangerous it is to have a movement telling people of color that they are betraying their cause by studying science. That couldn't possibly be a worse thing for people of color. If you believe, as I do, that a highly desirable state, or the most desirable state for the world, is one in which opportunity is fairly distributed, so everyone has access to it, then sidelining people of color who have an impulse to study science is a terrible setback, right? We need to, what I was doing for 14 years was trying to give the tools of science to people who would then wield them in favor of a world that actually made sense.
Have you seen the movie Black Panther?
No, not yet.
You should see it. You should see it. It is, among other things, a call to teach science to black kids. But let me emphasize. I mean, I'm not really arguing the equity versus Enlightenment case here. I mean, I would say, as a little bit of a tangent, that of course sometimes people use Enlightenment. I mean, you're saying those people are using equity in some sense disingenuously. I would say people can be accused of using Enlightenment in some sense disingenuously. I mean, when Sam Harris and people like that engage in what could arguably be interpreted as the denigration of Islam, they say they're doing it in the name of Enlightenment. You could have an argument about that. Anyway, I don't want to so much argue that with you as say that my point is just that my conception of the psychological mechanisms that are activated by an incident like yours is that it does become fundamentally pro-Bret Weinstein, anti-Bret Weinstein, and that and that both sides are going to have to work hard to not process incoming information through that paradigm, if you know what I mean. So if somebody actually came up with some actually valid critique of you, say, from the standpoint of equity, your supporters, their instinct, their initial reaction to it is going to be like affectively negative. And it works the other way. I'm just saying that I think that's an important part of the nature of the dynamic that we need to tamp down in America broadly, if we're going to get past a period of kind of acute political polarization.
Well, I mean, I fully agree that we have to tamp that down. I do think we have to do it in a game theoretically aware way. In other words, if what you do is tell people, don't behave like that, but the people who do behave like that come out ahead, the people who ignore you come out ahead, then we will see evolution in the direction of ignoring the advice that they should put those tribal instincts aside. On the other hand, I have no doubt that there were people who aligned with me who didn't really understand the arguments. How could that not be the case? On the other hand, there was, I mean, first of all, so few faculty were willing to say out loud that they supported me. I mean, I got no end of support privately, but the culture of fear made it seem very one-sided. That, I don't accept that this is a symmetrical fight between tribes. This is a fight between two conceptions of how things should function. And one of them was an equality of opportunity camp. I happened to be in the equality of opportunity camp. I told my colleagues that if you are fighting for equality of outcome, you are fighting for a discredited ideology, both on logical grounds and historical grounds. And I actually got a response that was, no, it's not discredited. It wasn't, that's not what we're doing. It was, no, equality of outcome is a perfectly viable thing to fight for.
Well, so are you against affirmative action?
Well, am I against affirmative action? I'm not against it in principle.
Yeah. Okay.
The idea that there is the justification for righting historical wrongs in a temporary fashion in order that we can reach a state of equality of opportunity, I believe is justified. On the other hand, I believe the experience of affirmative action is that it was counterproductive in many cases. And so I'm not in favor of it as a mechanism because I don't think it's useful. But I'm not averse to the idea that intervention is justified to achieve a fair state from which we can claim that differences in outcome have a strong likelihood of being about something other than fundamental structural inequities.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I'm wondering, do you have a theory as to why things have gotten so intense among some student bodies? And I should say, I was just reading a tweet storm by Will Wilkinson, kind of quasi-libertarian thinker, who was saying, he has spent a lot of time at like big state schools, and he's saying we shouldn't over-extrapolate from what's going on at small liberal arts colleges and elite institutions. He's saying there are a lot of colleges where this is just the whole free speech, political correctness, whatever you want to call it. It's not a thing, but still, it is something at a number of elite institutions and a number of small liberal arts colleges. And I'm wondering, I remember I was visiting Northern California. I don't know if it was like probably about 5-6 years ago, maybe more. And a friend of mine who teaches at Stanford, who's progressive, said, I'll tell you, I've never seen activism. It's been a long time since I've seen this much activist energy among students, and he was kind of happy about it. He's a progressive. I think things hadn't moved as far as it has at this point, but something has been bubbling up for a while. It has now assumed a form that you and a number of other faculty members, I guess more and more of whom are speaking up, are unhappy about. But do you have a theory, like, how did this happen?
There are a number of contributors, but I want to go back and correct a couple things, because the hot take of the moment is that there is no free speech crisis on college campuses, and that, you can't extrapolate from these rare extreme cases and all of that. And I think the thing is so wrong-headed that let's just fix it before we go down that rabbit hole. So first of all, I don't think this is a free speech crisis at all. Free speech is a terrible framework for evaluating what's taking place. For one thing, free speech is too closely tied to First Amendment protections. And there's no reason to be more troubled by what took place at Evergreen, because it happens to be a public college where the First Amendment applies, than what takes place at Reed, 100 miles south of here, because it happens to be a private college. We should be either troubled by what's taking place because it interferes with Enlightenment-based education, or we should not be troubled because for some reason the activism is valuable or worth the cost or whatever. So free speech is not the right rubric. But I also think thinking of it in terms of college campuses is not the right rubric either. That it happens that college campuses are where we are seeing the first battle in a war that is spreading. And we should be very troubled by the fact that the ideas that are motivating this movement that we are seeing on college campuses, where speakers are being shut down and faculty are being driven out, that movement is actually sending people into the workforce, into government, who have these same wrong ideas. So the story of the moment that doesn't fit the pattern is the Google story. And in the Google story, Google, a private concern where First Amendment protections do not exist, fired James Damore for responding to a prompt soliciting insight into sex-based inequity at Google. He wrote quite a good memo that was quite concordant with scientific understanding of sex differences. He was fired for it, and then the NLRB said that his firing was legitimate. The basis on which the NLRB said the firing was legitimate was that the harm done by what he said was significant enough to justify his ouster. Now, that is a legally preposterous rationale for firing somebody. And the fact that Google doesn't happen to have been on the minds of the founding fathers, so they didn't include Google in the First Amendment because they feared governmental tyranny and they didn't fear internet tyranny, is really not surprising. You know, founding fathers had never seen a chainsaw. The idea that they could anticipate the protections one would need in the internet age seems pretty far-fetched. So anyway, what I would say is, at the moment, the heat is on college campuses, and the issue of free speech comes up because periodically free speech protections provide a useful tool to fend off this facile movement. But we are wrong to think of it in those terms. This is a fight not about the Enlightenment, I should point out. It's a fight about enlightenment, about the idea that it is even possible. The fact that this movement finds its roots in critical theory, which is a form of postmodernism, where the central idea in postmodernism, and postmodernism, just like intersectionality, is an idea that has a truth at its core, but the truth at its core has been weaponized against the notion that some things are more correct than others. The reason that intersectionality doesn't care for population level analysis is because it doesn't even believe that there's something to find with a population level analysis.
So let me try to guess what you think is true about postmodernism. The idea that indeed in human discourse, some people have disproportionate power, and that can at least temporarily warp consensus. I mean, you know, the views of powerful people can distort collective thought and so on. Is that the part that's not wrong about postmodernism?
Well, I would say the part that's not wrong about postmodernism is that we are stuck with everything we know coming in through a perceptual apparatus that is not objective.
Right.
And so there's something that we need to be suspicious of in everything that has come to us through any perceptual modality. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, I would argue the go-to tool to correct for bias is science. It is not a surrender to the idea that all things are biased and therefore it is one bias against another. The only thing there is power. The right answer is for us to figure out what is true in spite of our biases, and science is the ultimate bullshit detector. So we are dethroning the one mechanism that actually frees us from the problems that postmodernism has correctly identified.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that science, and people misunderstand this, and sometimes the critique of science you hear from the left is that, you know, how naive can you be to think that individual scientists are objective? Well, that's not the premise of science. The premise of science is that it's a group process that weeds out, however long it may take, weeds out individual, filters out individual, or neutralizes everyone's individual biases and leads to a collective product that is to some extent free of them. But I would also say, I mean, when you say science is the go-to kind of enlightenment tool, I would, and this would steer, as you alluded to my writing about Buddhism. I mean, there's another meaning of the term enlightenment, and I think it has a place here, and I think it has a particular place in the realm that science does not even purport to have power, which is to say, when we're not arguing about merely statements of fact or descriptions of physical reality, but we're having ideological combat and things like that. I think it's times like that when a kind of a meditative discipline that cools your affective reactions to what is coming in can actually lead to more reasoned discourse and less of the kind of thing you found yourself involved in.
Well, I would divide the landscape up a little differently, but I probably land almost exactly where you do. So I would say the value of science in that process is to inform the part of you that brings in values. So yeah. I would separate, values are not recoverable scientifically necessarily. In other words, you might prioritize safety over my priority for a willingness to take risk. And we can't say that you're right or wrong or vice versa. But telling us how risky something is an objective question. We can analyze over a number of individuals who've participated in a particular activity how frequent the rate of different kinds of harm are. So in order to inform the process that meditates, you need a dispassionate, objective understanding of what's true. And you'll never get to perfectly dispassionate. But even at the level, you're talking about science as a group process. I, of course, believe that that is true, but I also believe that we make a mistake where we conflate science with that which scientists do. And most scientists are not scientific. In fact, if you go to the journal Science or the journal Nature, you'll be amazed at how many papers don't spell out any relationship to a hypothesis whatsoever, right? That's not science. Maybe it's observation, maybe it's the first step of science, but we've lost track of the way the method actually does correct for bias. And so I would say an individual scientist who's good at what they do will wield that method so that a bias, an expectation that they have, will be upended by an experiment that they either propose or run. So even an individual deploying the method can correct for their own bias. Can they do it perfectly? Of course.
They can. At the same time, one thing that annoys me about some of the, I think this was from Lawrence Krauss, but something you hear from the kind of new atheist scientists sometimes is like, we are delighted to be proven wrong. That's like total bullshit. I'm sorry. Nobody's initial reaction to being proven wrong is delight. And this is just something that bothers me about the air of superiority that is projected by what you might call the hyper-rationalists, although I'm all in favor of using reason to the full extent of its powers. But I mean, you know what I mean. It's like we all should indulge in intellectual humility because we are all humans, and none of us are above these kinds of reactions.
Well, so I would say that there is an enlightened way of viewing that puzzle, and that the idea that we should be delighted when we find out that our hypothesis is wrong is obviously just not true at a human level.
Right.
But so once upon a time, when science was a gentleman's sport, and I'm not saying that it's a good thing that it was a gentleman's sport, but it did have some positive attributes to it, which is that as long as the people doing it were not depending on it to feed them, they were actually freer to navigate, and the incentives inside of science were more correct. In other words, instead of trying to get through your career and continue to advance in an academic setting, if the point was, well, I'd actually like the history books to reflect that I was right and ahead of my time, then you have an incentive to get on the right side of an issue that you were wrong about as quickly as possible. Mm-hmm. And so what I've said to students for many years is being wrong is no fun, but the cost of accepting that you were wrong is small compared to the cost of continuing to be wrong. So what you want to do is invest in discovering where you are wrong, mm-hmm. and get to the right side of the issue as honestly and as quickly as possible so that you stop paying that ongoing cost.
Right. But I would say even there, in getting to where you're encouraging them to get, the kind of Eastern kind of enlightenment helps. The kind of meditative disciplines that reduce the power of the ego are going to make you more quickly see that you were actually wrong. Usually people who won't admit that they're wrong, it isn't that they know they're wrong and won't admit it, it's that they don't believe they're wrong.
So I would argue that's in part the result of perverse incentives that can actually pay you for being wrong and continuing to be wrong and defending your wrong position effectively. So that's the nature of modern academic science. But so I have occasionally, mostly tongue-in-cheek, but called myself an accidental Buddhist. I've not studied Buddhism, but every place that I've encountered it, I find that it's actually quite concordant with where you end up if you follow the logical arguments to their conclusions. So in any case, I do think there is something to divorcing yourself from the idea that you are pursuing. In other words, I've never thought it was a great idea to have your theorists be your experimentalists. At the moment, our graduate training system in science says that basically theory is the privilege of those who have demonstrated their capacity experimentally, whereas a scientific process in which theorists proposed experiments and experimentalists tested them and therefore did not have a perverse incentive to find the hypothesis true, that would be a much more effective system. And what we have now is a system in which people are effectively rewarded for what I see most frequently is people will see a pattern in data and then they will pretend that they had a hypothesis which they have now tested. So the way science functions, there's all the difference in the world between seeing a pattern in the data and proposing a hypothesis and then running another test versus seeing a pattern in the data and pretending that the data is a test of that hypothesis, which is not scientifically valid. But when it comes to a publish or perish world, there is an incentive to pretend that every pattern that shows up in the data was the test of a hypothesis that existed before the data was collected. And so people who cheat and who make that leap end up advancing, which means that it's pseudoscience. But it's very hard to spot if you're reading a journal article and you weren't there for the moment of discovery of the pattern.
Well, another problem with the fusion of theoretician and experimentalist is people who happen upon some important or surprising experimental finding maybe stumble upon, maybe happen upon it because they're good experimentalists and they have an instinct for the interesting questions, but whatever. Then they are taken really seriously as theoreticians all of a sudden, and they write these books where they throw out these crazy ideas and everybody buys the books. But anyway, we've gotten less far than I had hoped in the course of what is usually about as long as you go an hour. There's thing or two I'd like to say, and I want to give you a chance to say more things. I mean, maybe we should, if you're up for it, maybe we should have another conversation where we get into more of, because I want to get into your post controversy life and the way that plays out, and the company you find yourself in now. Because there's a number of people that you are now associated with that you may in many ways not be like ideologically along many dimensions, but they are fighting the same fight you're fighting. And that's a whole dynamic that, because we should say you would certainly identify yourself as left of center. Not everyone fighting the fight you're fighting does. In fact, most of them probably don't. And so I want to get into that, and maybe we can save that for another date. I want to let me say a couple of things I want to say, and then let you say whatever you want to say. Quickly, just a word in defense of social justice warriors. Just that what I mean is, like, I have a daughter who graduated from college just nearly a year ago. And she was loosely in the company of what you could call social justice warriors. And that involves some uses of language that I didn't totally get. Like, as you know, the term white supremacist is just defined in a way it wasn't defined when we were young. It just means something different. It used to mean the explicit ideology of asserting that whites are superior and therefore deserve A, B, and C. That's what white supremacy used to mean. They've changed the definition in ways I don't totally understand. I'm not sure about the utility of using the term the way they are. So there's things like that. On the other hand, if you look at the work they are doing, I mean, her work is focused on prison reform, her issues about mass incarceration, the casual use of solitary confinement, the way people who don't have the resources to get a good lawyer spend forever in jail before they even get a trial. And not infrequently were wrongly accused. So these are very important issues, and she and her friends are by and large spending their time on very important issues, and that's part of being a social justice warrior.
Yes and no.
Okay.
I would argue the problem with, and I get various kinds of advice about the term social justice warrior, but I also haven't seen the replacement term for it. So let's just use it without any judgment involved. The problem is many of the people, probably most of the people who find themselves in that camp are essentially being fooled by these little linguistic tricks. And so white supremacy is a perfect example. it's interesting that you recognize that white supremacy has been redefined, but you wouldn't know what the definition is, right? There's a reason for that. It's because it doesn't have a definition. It doesn't have a definition because it needs to have two definitions that can be swapped out at will. So white supremacy means something like the tolerance of a systemic bias in favor of white people. So I could defend the idea of a structural bias in favor of white people strictly on the basis that zip codes are not evenly distributed by race, and that because we collect tax revenues by zip code and then we fund public schools with those tax revenues, that it's a self-reinforcing system that doesn't actually involve anybody's active participation, right? But if you sign up for the idea that maybe you're a white supremacist because you're not voting for or you're not fighting for zip code redistribution, then at the penalty phase of what we're going to do about your white supremacy, Bob, is we are going to jack the penalties back up to cross-burning white supremacy level of penalty. So it is the ability to dodge between a threshold so low that everybody is guilty and a penalty phase that recovers the original stigma of the term white supremacy. That's the trick. So I don't know anything about your daughter and what she's involved in. It sounds like she's involved in issues that I agree are chronic and very serious. So it is a goodness of spirit that leads a person to want to confront these things. But a person with that goodness of spirit who is faced by a group of people, some of them perfectly cynical, who are wielding a tactical glossary in order to trap people into signing up for roles that they wouldn't otherwise. You know, the number of words here that have been distorted in some sort of tactical way, from ally to white supremacy to racist to equity. All of these terms are just like white supremacy in the sense that they don't have a meaningful definition because they need to be able to shift subtly after, between from one sentence to the next. So I would argue that what your daughter is involved in is very important, but that she is susceptible to being dragged into a movement that will say, what I've said in other contexts is that the label on the box is laudable, but the contents of the box aren't what is on the label. So Black Lives Matter. Do Black Lives matter? Of course Black Lives matter. Is it all lives matter? No. Black Lives Matter means Black lives are undervalued, right? I resonate with that. I'm sure you resonate with that. But if you say, well, I must be with Black Lives Matter, well, go to their website and look what Black Lives Matter stands for. You've just signed up for a whole slate of things that don't have anything to do with Black lives being undervalued.
And I'm curious, what's the most objectionable thing from your point of view?
Well, I don't want to say the most objectionable thing, but I would say the very fact that Black Lives Matter is associated with a position on the state of Israel in its predicament is conspicuous, because what it means is that somebody like me who says, I know that Black lives are undervalued by the society that I am a citizen of, and that I have obligations that follow directly from that undervaluing, I am now put in a position where my obligation to sign up for that puts me in some sort of position with respect to policy with the state of Israel that I didn't volunteer for, right? The fact that I'm a believer in Black lives being undervalued shouldn't mean that I have to therefore sign up for a slate of other positions on
meaning, for the sake of, just in your defense, meaning that you believe it is a fact that they're undervalued, not that you believe it's a good thing. Just to clarify.
I believe it's a terrible thing. And, this is why my students stood by me, is that I wasn't shy about telling them what mechanisms I thought resulted in things like the undervaluing of lives of people from certain populations. I was clear with them about the relationship that evolution has to those processes, and also the role that I think evolutionary science has in figuring out the road out of those predicaments. So we really do have a battle between two viewpoints. One is that we should hard code the solution to inequities based on some simple formula and just reverse these inequities. Mm-hmm. And the other is, let's figure out how these things work and unhook them forever. And I'm solidly in the unhook 'em forever camp. I'm not shy and I'm not a coward about doing it, but I ended up on the wrong end of that movement because it didn't like the idea of figure out how they work and unhook them forever. It had another plan.
Okay, well, let's continue the conversations. One more thing I want to say that's self-promotional, and then I'll ask you for any self-promotion you can think of that you might want to do yourself, ranging from Twitter handle to whatever. Two things. We mentioned my book about Buddhism. It's called Why Buddhism is True. And it does locate Buddhism and Buddhist meditation explicitly in the context of kind of the psychology of tribalism, the problem of tribalism. I have one other venture related to that, put out something called the Mindful Resistance newsletter. The premise is that Trumpism, if you are inclined to not like it, is best opposed, mindfully, to some extent in the plain English sense of the word, of just carefully, deliberately, calmly. And then that stance might indeed be abetted by meditation, but in any event, it's an attempt to process each week's news from that standpoint. It's at mindfulresistance.net. Now, as for Bret promotion, first of all, you're on Twitter. You've seen a rapid growth in your Twitter following since this happened, I'm sure.
I have 400 Twitter followers in May to, I think I'm almost at 100,000.
So there are upsides to being a victim of whatever you would say you're a victim of. And what is your Twitter handle? At what?
At Bret Weinstein.
Okay,
Bret
so that was not taken. And
nope.
then
I have had that one for quite some time.
Okay. So what you were an early adopter. So what else should people look at that you've written, or URLs, or what?
Well, I would say if people are interested in the Evergreen story, I did a early interview with Dave Rubin on the Rubin Report, an early one with Joe Rogan. There's the Washington Examiner article that you mentioned, which was written by my wife and myself.
We will link to all this, yeah.
If you're interested in evolution and sexual dynamics, my wife and I did a recent Joe Rogan, I think it's 1081, on various things related to human sexuality. I did a Sam Harris live podcast in Seattle a couple months ago that covered a lot of ground. It covered race, it covered sex and gender. Anyway, I think it's quite a good one. People can go to my Patreon, which is my name, Bret Weinstein with one T. And I've put up some YouTube videos covering various evolutionary topics. Subscribers can vote on topics to have me cover evolutionarily. And I don't know, maybe that's where we are.
Okay, and when I say we will have the links to these things, I mean on the bloggingheads.tv site. If you're watching this on YouTube, I don't think we have the capacity in our YouTube channel to present all that, but at there's also a version of this conversation on bloggingheads.tv, and if you click links mentioned below the video player, you'll see the links I'm talking about. So thanks. Let's do this again. Let's have a part 2 if you're up for that. And in the meanwhile, thanks a lot for taking the time.
Thanks for having me, and maybe in our next conversation we can talk a little bit about Nonzero.
My book, Nonzero, you mean? I would be happy to do that. In fact, maybe we should continue this. No. Let's hold off. We'll save that for next time. But thanks for mentioning it. Okay. Take care.
Looking forward to it, Bob.